Okay, so with this, it's time to welcome our next speaker. Is Mr. Sian. He is solution architect in Ingram Micro. So Sihan has more than 8 years of experience in the IT industry and as well experienced in leading and setting up various RPA automation models for logistic, BPO, petrochemical, finance, and insurance. Currently, he is a solution architect in Ingram Micro Australia. Today he will speak on the topic taking RPA to the next level. So over to you, Sian.
You for the introduction, Atul. Also, I would like to appreciate Mike. So it was a very nice presentation. It really gave a valuable insight, and I was very happy to have seen your presentation. So
Thank
yeah,
you.
so I'll be talking about taking RPA to the next level. Um, so basically, in the next 30 minutes, we're going to talk about what RPA is and how, not really what RPA is, but how RPA is a journey, the pitfalls of RPA in order for us to be able to make it successful, as well as how we are actually able to scale it up accordingly with a center of excellence. When we talk about the center of excellence, we will be talking about certain pillars such as governance, people, technology, process, and organizational adoption. I'd like to set it at an early stage wherein whenever we talk about RPA, we should have the mindset that it is not just another project in the organization. It should be considered as a journey because you're actually dealing with processes. And once you actually deploy these processes, it doesn't stop there. You should always continue to look at the process, how you're actually going to improve it, ramp it up, and how you're going to be able to institutionalize the RPA within the organization itself. And this doesn't stop with just one of your processes. It will actually continue because eventually once the RPA is once the implementation is successful, you're actually going to do it for the next projects as well. So that is why we don't consider it just as a project, but it's an overall journey that your team and your organization will be having. And thus, it actually needs to be continuously be improved. Before we actually scale up any RPA implementation or any RPA project within the organization, we should identify how we can actually make sure that it will not fail at the early onset. Because as per Ernst and Young studies or survey that they have done, 30 to 50% of the RPA projects or RPA implementation doesn't actually scale up, or it actually ends at the early stage. This is because of the list of items that I'm showing now. So the first one would be definitely to be able to select a process, or selecting just any process to implement. When we talk about robotics process automation, we should be able to ensure that the process would have to undergo certain checks and balances, such as initial process assessment, to be able to identify whether it is actually feasible for automation. And besides that, we are actually able to identify the complexity, because during this stage, we are trying to set the expectations to everyone that, okay, this is how long it will take, this is what you're going to expect, and so on. The next one would be whenever implementing an RPA or your RPA journey. Uh, when RPA started, it was told that it's a low code platform that you can do it yourselves, that it's very easy to do. But what you notice now would be that you don't see RPA vendors doing that. Because typically, if you're able to do it, then if you're going to do it yourself, you might not be following the best practices. You might not be following the certain standards that were actually created by these organizations. So it's always good whenever you start your RPA journey to work with a systems integrator who have had experience in doing those things. This will actually allow you to learn and not repeat the same mistakes that other organizations did beforehand. Before you also when dealing with RPA, you also need to always improve the process owner. So because in not involving the process owners, don't give you access to the vast knowledge that they have when it comes to knowing the process, the rules of the process. So don't be afraid to re-engineer the process as well. so that you can actually identify the pain points and bottlenecks of the process owners. So that is why their importance is really key to a success of a project. Another pitfall is when organizations start, they are very happy that the robot is actually doing the happy scenario. Let's always consider that exceptions handling must be incorporated, process rules must be identified, and those if and then conditions must be satisfied. Because if you only implement a happy path in any implementation, it will actually lead to frustrations because you didn't expect that this is going to happen and that is going to happen. So the next part is setting up expectations properly. Whenever I work with process owners, with business users, I see two types of people. One is the very optimistic one who thinks that RPA can do everything and anything under the sun, and the one that is very pessimistic because maybe they are afraid that
Uh,
RPA will take over.
Sorry to interrupt. Are you going to share the slides?
I'm sharing my screen.
No,
Oh,
actually, I can't see the screen actually.
oh, let me. I'm sharing the screen. Let me reshare once more. Sorry about that. I thought it was shared already.
Yes, yes. Now I can see the screen.
Thank you for letting me know, Atul, and apologies to everyone for not knowing that it was not shared. Sorry. Yeah. So we were talking about setting of the proper expectations. So basically, you need to set it at the early onset. You also need to identify. So there is also a poor strategy and tools. So whenever an RPA implementation is started, there are instances where the product strengths were not really identified, whether the process would need OCR or they realized they have to start with OCR, or they were not able to identify that, okay, there is a product that is able to perform native integrations and so on. So, and another part is not considering the community base. So, having a very strong community base will actually help you on your RPA journey. And the last one is actually treating RPA as a project. So whenever we implement RPA, we don't use it, think of it as a project, but we have to consider it as an overview, as an overall. We need to have a helicopter view or a bird's eye view of that. Let's also consider that it should not be a changing development team because whenever you change the team, you actually increase the risks, you increase the delays in the projects as well. And this will actually lead to improper testing as well, and so on. Now that we have identified what not to do in an RPA project, let's also talk more about the success factors of an effective RPA project implementation. So the first one is you communicate properly. There's nothing wrong with communication. You should be able to identify uh, what are the issues, what are the risks. You need to come up with a RASI model. You also select the right process because selecting the right process will actually lead to a make or break in your journey. So remember that the first process that you implement typically has the most number of eyes looking at it because they're expecting it to succeed. You have to form the right team. You need to get the process owner's commitment. You need to get the dedicated team members to work on this RPA implementation. You need to map out and visualize the process as clearly as possible. You need to work with process SMEs, relook at the process, define whether there can be certain improvements that can be introduced. And whenever we're dealing with test scenarios, let's deal with it at a very early stage. Let's tell the process owners, okay, we need test scenarios for this. We need this number of test data. We need to be able to identify what is the happy scenario, what are the negative flows and uncommon scenarios that you are facing, so that we can introduce it and include it in the implementation. Another one is they have created test scenarios, but they didn't include the prepare the environment. So at the early stage, we also need to ensure that there is a proper working environment for development, UAT, and production. And if there are other more environments that are needed, it should be introduced very early. And yeah, let's not take any shortcuts. So whenever we are implementing any RPA implementation, we always consider test, test, test. You need to do unit testing for each of the modules. You need to do integration testing to combine those modules, as well as do not rush the UAT stage because this is actually able to let the process owners know that your process is working seamlessly. And of course, don't we also have to introduce a hypercare stage. So once we have satisfied these success factors, I believe we will be able to come up with a successful implementation. But how do we typically define a successful journey? Does it end with one successful implementation? Does it end with your bots working? I believe it is there is a lot more to that one. From my point of view, it is always going to be an organizational adoption that is important, wherein you actually have an RPA sponsor that will be backing you up. You have a strong pipeline. You have a change management team that will be able to address and help the team in the organization to address these changes as well. The IT team will definitely be a big factor. The go ahead with IT departments, the to be able to discuss security, to discuss scalability, make sure that everything is compliant with regard to the organizational standards should also be incorporated. And at the end of the day, how I see it is an organization should be self-sufficient. An organization should be having their own RPA capability to be able to leverage and scale their journey without being very much dependent on systems integrators. So that is where we talk about the Center of Excellence framework. And with the Center of Excellence framework, we actually will be tackling 5 pillars. Let's start with the governance. So when you talk about any governance with a center of excellence, you'll be considering three types of COEs. Typically, a centralized one where you actually have one RPA COE to serve all of the business units. So typically, this one is the one that is having a problem to scale up because everything is just within one COE. So there are certain difficulties here, but it's always best to start with this. Another one is a hybrid where you have one main COE and smaller COEs that will be always getting information from the center COE so that they can actually pass it on to a list of wider teams. Another one is a federated where you actually have independent COEs. The key thing that I notice with independent COEs would be they actually don't have the same standards as the other ones. So when we talk about a proposed setup, I always consider having initially a hybrid, a centralized COE at first. And then once you have stabilized and gained traction for that centralized COE, then you convert it into a hybrid COE. That way, you can actually have a lot more avenues for automation and a lot more opportunities in decision making when you actually progress in the further months to years to come. When we talk about governance considerations, there is a lot more to just having those initial process. But we actually have to consider whether we have a process selection criteria. Are there any standards and best practices that must be followed? Are there some development guidelines that we have to adhere to? Some deployment considerations, who's going to deploy, is the IT team going to be involved, how we will be running and operating the robots when they have been deployed. We also need to consider how the credentials would be stored. Where will we be storing it? Who will have and who will know those credentials? This system must be always be in place. How do we handle with sensitive information? As well as when we consider our journey, we also need to set up the proper architecture in order for us to be able to make sure that our bots, when we become very much reliant, it will not fail us eventually. Because if we have a very poor architecture set up, then let's say if a server goes down, we might lose access and so on. So we need to set up those architecture and plan those architecture accordingly. And when we deal with RPA, when we have a center of excellence, it's always good to have certain metrics and templates available when it comes to reporting. So this is something that must always be considered. The stakeholders, the top management are actually always looking at it. I also came up with my suggested delivery methodology when you're actually having a center of excellence. So I call this the double agile loop. So basically, what we are doing is the center of excellence will always keep on looking for process intake. So typically, this is where they generate the pipeline, where they actually look at the pipeline, identify various processes, decide whether this process should be implemented or not. And then during the realization phase of the first agile loop or the intake, this is where they actually take the perform the development life cycle, where under the realization you actually have the software development life cycle of an RPA project until you complete it, until you deploy it, and then you maintain it. However, like what I said, we always have to be able to improve our process. We always need to have a review and evaluation stage here that will actually let you know that is the process still efficient? Are we meeting the targets for this? Is there any way to improve the process and so on? So if there are, then we will actually come up with certain requests that will allow us to actually improve the efficiency of those processes. When it comes to people, we should have a dedicated team or a group of people that will actually be part of our center of excellence. I would say that we always need to have a project sponsor because the program sponsor will actually be the vision and will be the custodian of the RPA projects. And this program sponsor typically should be on the higher level or if possible the C-level executive. That way they can actually help push RPA within the organization itself and remove the blockers along the way. But of course, this program sponsor should have the idea that automation will be very helpful in the organization as well. There are other roles and responsibilities. I won't be digging deep in detail considering that we have a few minutes left. And when you actually talk about the people framework, you always consider the governance team. You identify who is responsible for this framework. What is the matrix? What are the roles and responsibilities in the organization? You're going to define full ownership of the project to whom, what are they responsible for, and what they will be focusing on. You also have hierarchy, wherein you actually have the escalation matrix and procedures, who to go to for this, who to go to for that. You identify the skills and competencies for the required role and not just put somebody within that role. So they should be able to identify the right person so that you can actually have a strong center of excellence team. There are instances that you really don't have the correct person yet, but of course within the COE you'll be able to adopt. The team member should be able to adapt. So you should provide continuous learning through various trainings that are available. And of course, you need to have a proper COE onboarding plan in place. So it can be a process onboarding plan, a framework that will enable you to onboard team members within the COE, how you're going to hire team members, people, and so on. We also will tackle technology. And in the technology space, I always quote David Allen. And what David Allen mentioned is if your only tool that you have is a hammer, it's very hard to eat spaghetti. I would like to correlate this to a process. If you have a product or a tool, if you actually don't have a tool that will meet your RPA needs, then it will be very hard to implement. And it will actually set certain expectations within the organization. So they would sometimes feel that, okay, I need to have a product that will be able to work with various applications. But if that product is not able to do so, then I don't think it would be the best product that you would be wanting to use on those systems or that process. So I've come up with a get rights of your RPA tool. So of course, the first one would be how your team members would be enabled. So you need to have available training. You need to have the product should be able to work with various software. Will be program agnostic, so that they should have native integrations. The product should be very easy to use. They can be used for recording. They can be used to drag and drop a low code platform. They are designed for citizen developers and developers alike. I also consider the speed, because when we look at automation, we always want our ROI to be met, and the speed of the platform really helps a lot. We also don't want a platform that will not be compatible with the previous versions. So we need to have a continuous product support. The cost of ownership should be not prohibitive enough so that we can start our RPA journey. The product features should be made available and should continuously be developed. Thus, the scalability will be put in place. And the product should also have various deployment options, because not all organizations would have the same deployment options available. Some would like to go on premise, some would like to go to cloud, some would like a hybrid model, and so on. The strong community base is definitely a factor. Plus, your product should be able to comply with the governance and the governance requirements of various regions, various geographies as well. From my point of view, I would suggest, or I would actually select UiPath as a product, because it actually allows you to actually work across your automations, from the very onset of process discovery to development phase, to managing the solutions accordingly, to running the robots across various applications, and engaging people and robots to work together, to be able to collaborate and work on various tasks. Of course, not not we also need to consider that stakeholders will be looking at the process, so that the solution that you have should be able to identify and govern the automation that the users have built. That you're able to identify both operational and business results that will allow you to show that your program is very much effective and is going to return the ROI of what you have invested. And UiPath actually tackles UiPath actually has various products that will be catering to various team members. It may be COE leads who are actually trying to identify process for automations, and identify also and measure various matrices of the product. You also have developers such as citizen developers or process owners who would like to build their own automation, as well as the developers who will be building the automations themselves. You also should have the IT operators involved, wherein they can actually help with the more complex processes like managing the task, managing the robots, coming up with certain machine learning models, coming up with business intelligence reports, and so on. And those typical automation users who are actually running the processes. So UiPath actually has this overall platform that will allow you to have a fully automated enterprise. And besides that, I was mentioning about various deployment options. You can either deploy it on automation cloud, your own cloud, hybrid cloud, or an on-premise setup. And yeah, so you actually have a platform that will be able to support a very robust ecosystem as well. And this is not all, but these are just some of the platforms that it is able to actually integrate with. When we talk about processes, you always need to have a healthy pipeline. And for me, performing process discoveries and process frameworks will actually help that. So you do exploratory workshops where you bring in the stakeholders together and identify more processes to work on, and identify and set a clear objectives with them. You also do, after those exploratory workshops, you actually do process modeling, where you identify each of the process, what are the as is process out of it, and investigate the process flows to be able to come up with something that can make your process more efficient. And finally, you have a review where you actually recalibrate this processes. You show that this is what you're going to do. You formulate an implementation plan. And by having these things, you'll actually be able to come up with a healthy pipeline as well, and identify those processes that you feel are not suitable for implementation. You also have a process framework where you can actually come up with an opportunity assessment where you're actually able to pipeline the processes in terms of prioritization based on savings or based on needs. You should come up with process metrics and KPI calculations to determine which ones you should prioritize first. You also can do demand generation exercises. I'll be talking about the automation flywheel in the next slide, but the rest would be the typical RPA awareness sessions and workshops. And internally, you can actually create a collaborative platform or make use of UiPath Automation Hub to actually identify other processes as well. So the automation flywheel is typically what UiPath promotes when you actually start your or you implement your RPA journey, where you actually start with the center of excellence, building the first process, and then implementing it and deploying it to the employees. And what this does is it actually gives awareness internally that, okay, we have automation in place. Can we do more? So employees, they use your automation and then they realize they have another one, they have another, then they will submit it again to the COE. And it doesn't stop there. So other team members would also want to be able to build their COE or provide their ideas as well. So once those people actually build their own tools, they can actually submit it to the Center of Excellence, where the Center of Excellence would govern that, review it, make sure that it is on the proper standard, and then eventually providing the automation as well to all employees in the organization. So this is definitely something that I have seen very successful because having the process owners identify their processes and having them showcase those processes to others really make a big impact. When we talk about organizational adoption, uh, we should not be we should not consider that okay, somebody's work using the process and that's it. So organizational adoption actually talks about the team members within the organization becoming certified, becoming very much aware that there is an automation in place. You should have hands-on exercises for them so that they can actually practice their skills. You do diagnostic assessments. You have provide continuous trainings, and eventually, you'll be able to have some case studies that will actually showcase that the organization is very well versed in RPA. And when we talk about organization has adopted. I have this idea of a co-development model in place. So basically, I was mentioning earlier, uh, end users should not always be dependent on vendors or systems integrators. So typically, a co-development approach talks about an end user and vendor working together, where initially vendors actually have more team members, resources in place to be able to help and support the end users, to train the team members, to be able to provide them the best practice and guidance. And as we move along, we will notice, and this is we will notice that we can actually help our end users to be self-sufficient eventually. Wherein, as you see at the 18th month stage, you actually have more team members from the end user than the vendor. So that is how I see that an organization has fully adapted into RPA is when they are able to actually come up with their own support structure. They'll be able to support their own projects, and they'll be able to maintain the issues without being too much dependent on vendor for just any minor change and so on. This is actually the end of my slide. I would like to open the floor if there are certain questions available. There are certain questions. Do let me know.
Yeah, so thank you, Sian, for your presentation. Now we are in the Q&A session. So, ladies and gentlemen, please unmute yourself and go ahead with the query. Anyone having anything to discuss? Any query? Anything, not query, then anything to discuss also, you can unmute yourself. You can use the chat box also in case you are not willing to come on video or an audio.
Hi, Sean. This is Tim Blizzard. How are you?
I'm good, Tim.
Good.
Thank you for asking.
I have two things. One is your presentation going to be available as a separate PowerPoint file, because I found your presentation to be extraordinarily valuable for our journey on RPA.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I've shared this with the team with Atul.
Yes, yes. Yeah, we all to all attendees, we share the presentation of all the speakers. Tim.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
My question or observation is you talked a little bit about citizen developers.
Mm-hmm.
With our experience internally is that very few staff members have the expertise, or for that matter, the motivation to undertake their own form of development. And obviously, we make technologies like Power Automate available to our staff.
Mm-hmm.
We have a very, very few staff. So we're talking 3 in 600, give or take, have either the skill or the desire to utilize the technology themselves. Furthermore, we have, stringent security requirements and a variety of other requirements that would probably not be well understood by citizen developers. So I guess my questions are, you talk about citizen developers, but how practical is it actually to leave end users in charge of their own development, especially with something as complex as bots, where you also need things like error handling, etc., which is concepts that are a bit beyond the average user. The other aspect to that is, shouldn't they be focused on their day job and simply offloading the development of bots to areas, to people who have an expertise in that field? So I'm interested in your thoughts about that, because my thinking is genuinely that citizen developers is actually a pretty bad idea. But you mentioned it quite often, so I thought I'd seek some further input.
That's true. Thank you for the question, Tim. So typically when you actually deal with citizen developers, you should always still have governance in place. So if the citizen developer will be developing the process that they will be using themselves to basically to be able to focus on a more meaningful task, then I think it would be okay. However, if you have citizen developers who will be building the solution and be providing it to the whole organization, that is something that you really have to look into with governance, because we want to make sure that those whatever they built, since they are actually not really full-time developers, they might not be following certain standards and procedures, and this will actually be very, very risky as well. So that is where the COE team will actually have to govern the automation that they built. So if we are going to pass it to various team members, the COE team should actually be looking at it, making sure that there are no sensitive information placed there, that it will actually be working in accordance to how it's supposed to be. And of course, proper training must be put in place. You don't let a citizen developer just create an automation without providing them certain guidelines. So that is where one of the pitfalls actually happen as well. So when you actually implement something, even if you're not a citizen developer, and you start on your own without proper training, without proper
Yeah,
enablement, it will always eventually cause some issues. So
yeah, and that's where I think citizen development kind of falls on its face a little bit, because you've also talked, quite extensively about the need for testing. But let's be honest, your average citizen developer is probably not going to be, to adopt those types of approaches. And so you end up with bots which haven't been thoroughly tested, and the outcomes aren't necessarily what the business requires. An example from an older age is that some studies have shown that something in the order of 50% of all formulas in spreadsheets produce inaccurate results, but nobody notices, because everybody assumes that the outcome of formulas in Excel spreadsheets are correct. And I worry about the same sorts of outcomes with citizen developers, that they don't thoroughly check their work, they don't thoroughly test their work, and what they end up with are bots which actually don't produce the outcomes anticipated, but nobody really notices.
In my
And an organisation either.
yes.
Um,
So in my experience with working with those citizen developers, one thing I noticed is if it is going to be for themselves, they will make sure that it is working because they don't want to do the task the same way manually again. So so typically, if you have a citizen developer who is building the automation for themselves, let's say for example, if they are creating an audit report and then they are actually going to build their own task,
yep.
at the end of the day, it will fall back to them if something is wrong. So definitely they will perform various testing to be able to ensure that this is actually working. Uh, and that makes it a lot less risky in the sense that you still have somebody who is actually there and auditing because your team member, the citizen developer who is building it for themselves, will really have to make sure that it is correct because manually, if they do it again, it will take a lot more time.
Yeah. I think
But,
you've
but I'll
answered
be
my question.
happy. Sorry?
No, that's right. I think you've answered my question because, this topic of citizen development, shows up a little bit at various conferences that I attend, and it's always worth a conversation to see how the presenter to find out what their experiences are genuinely like in that sphere and whether it's genuinely a viable approach. Which is not to say that it's viable in our organisation, but I was certainly interested in in a deeper understanding of your experience.
Mhm. And just wanted to highlight, typically when you deal with the citizen developers, we don't actually let them deal with a whole process, but just some tasks that they are actually
Right.
doing.
Okay, cool. Listen, thank you very much, Sean. I really enjoyed your presentation and found it very informative.
Thank you so much, Tim. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so thank you, Sian. Thank you for your presentation, and with a token of thank you for your valuable insight and valuable time, we share the certificate with you. Definitely, we'll share later with you on the mail. But here, definitely, we like to show this that we are going to provide you the certificate of honor for this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.